I'm Lelde. I'm Latvian, but I grew up in Melbourne, Australia. In 1995, when I was 7 years old, my parents decided to move to Latvia, which is where their families are originally from. Since then, I've lived in Scotland, which is where I studied, and I spent some time in Belgium and Canada as well on exchanges. But now I'm firmly back in Latvia. I've been back since 2013.
Hello, Lelde.
Hi, Mara.
How are you?
I'm good. Thanks very much for having me on the
Yeah.
show.
Thanks for being here. I have been very interested in interviewing you ever since many, many years ago. I started reading your blog about moving to Latvia and what life was like in Latvia, and actually really informed me about my own move. So I'm really glad that you're here today to tell us a little bit more of your own story.
It's really nice to hear that the blog is useful. That's why I do it.
So why don't you start by telling us a little bit about where you're from?
So you might have picked up on my really international English language and way of talking, with maybe the occasional Scottish touch or maybe even Australian touch. I am Latvian. Both my parents are Latvian, but I was born in Australia since my grandparents were Second World War emigres. So I grew up in Melbourne and attended Latvian school on Saturdays and spent a lot of time in the local Latvian community until in 1995, when I was 7, my family moved to Latvia, and my parents have been here ever since. My sister and I both studied abroad, but eventually returned. So I studied in Scotland and spent some time in Canada and Belgium as well on exchange. And I've been back in Latvia now since 2013.
Excellent. And when you think about where you're from, do you tend to say Australia and Latvia? Do you tend to favor one over the other?
Now I definitely say Latvia. It just comes completely naturally. I was so young when we moved from Australia that I honestly can't say that I remember much. When people ask me, oh, what's Australia like? It's very hard for me to respond because I can't really be objective after being away for so long. And I was so young when I lived there that I don't think I can really paint the picture of what it's like now. I've obviously been back a couple of times to visit, but that's not enough to really give a proper answer to what life's like in Australia these days.
So you don't quite remember Australia very well, but do you have memories around this idea of the transition of not having been from Latvia and then being a child in Latvia?
I certainly have memories, or if not memories, then I'm aware of stories that my parents have told me about that time. And I did find it quite difficult to integrate. I was very young. However, in Australia, you start school earlier than you do in Latvia. So I already had this experience of going to school and making friends, and yeah, I had to leave all that behind and start again, because in Latvia, since I was 7, I started in year 1 again. And because I had a bit of education already, then they ended up moving me to year 2 quite quickly. But yeah, so already at the beginning was quite quite tricky, quite complex. Involved a lot of moving back and forth. And then, since my parents were really keen for me to have an education, good education, first of all, but also an education that they felt they could identify with or could understand better. They also moved me a few times from school to school, which now in retrospect, I really appreciate and respect and understand. But back then it was kind of difficult for me to understand why they kept doing that. Somehow though, I still have kept some of the friendships that I formed in the first few grades of school here. So yeah, it definitely did work, even though it might not have seemed that way back then. But then there were all these little practical cultural things as well that made it a bit harder for me, like just the weather, the contrast between Australia and Latvia. In Australia, we had a house with a garden where I could just go and muck about and do my own thing. Here, we lived in an apartment, and I had access to a yard, but obviously not on my own. And in Australia, it was a lot more common to go and visit school friends after school. My parents obviously had really good friendships and people with kids who were normal for us to be picked up by someone else and you know, go and play at someone else's house for a few hours after school. And here in the beginning, we didn't really have much of that. Of course, it took time to develop new friendships and stuff. And then, yeah, all these little things that added up. And I think I took it out on my parents quite a lot from what I hear. But yeah, we've since gotten over it. I think it's only made us stronger as a family.
Wonderful. I had a similar experience when I was 6. My parents moved from New York City, big bustling city, to a small town outside of Minneapolis and St. Paul to be closer to my grandparents. And I also was very unhappy that I had been moved out of the place that I knew. And it really informed, I kind of held on to this idea that I belonged somewhere else until I then acted on it and went out back that direction. And I'm wondering for you, did that inform later wanting to travel? Or were there other reasons or other circumstances that led you to thinking outside of Latvia and going other places?
I think that was definitely a bit of sort of me being upset, yeah, involved in my decision to move abroad, to see what else is out there, because I didn't feel quite at home in Latvia. Even after a few years at school, just something didn't feel quite right. It's really hard to explain, and I don't really remember that well, I don't think. But yeah, I just remember always having this idea in mind that there must be something, you know, better out there. And it was probably just like, yeah, me not really knowing how to deal with emotions and stuff, and just not really being an adult yet. But also when I was at high school, I started traveling a lot with an organization called the European Youth Parliament. So I was always going to these youth conferences in places, well, all over Europe really, but Poland, Estonia, a lot was nearby. And then sometimes we'd get trips further out to France or Germany. And so I started to develop friendships abroad as well. And I think I really enjoyed the kind of anonymity that came with that, and just like going somewhere and starting anew and having to meet people and who know nothing about you and stuff. So yeah, when I was 18, after finishing high school, then I went to Scotland to study.
And so not your first time being an expat, but maybe a little different as you were older. What were things that you noticed from that experience, from kind of, again, moving abroad, similarities, differences, or other adjustments that you experienced?
Yeah, it was really great sort of to have that chance to just build your own thing, because this time it was my decision, not my family's decision. So I think I felt like I was the only one responsible for whatever would happen. And somehow I really liked that, and maybe it was the right age for something like that to happen as well. And it was very easy because a lot of people who started studying at uni had just left the home for the first time, or we all lived together in student halls. So that even just instantly gave us a common experience, and it was just very easy to get integrated this time. And even though it was a foreign country, there was enough in common because we were all 18-year-olds who'd just graduated. You know, we were all having all these first experiences. So with, just getting acquainted with what it's like to be at university rather than school, living somewhere away from your parents, managing your own budget, your own schedule, hangovers, everything that comes with a student.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. There are some pieces of that university life that are maybe not universal, but somewhat common across different students. And then where did this inspiration or motivation to continue to travel and continue to be abroad come from?
I think I felt like that was just the place for me to be, that I was meant to live this international kind of lifestyle. It was also what people kept saying, that they could imagine me living abroad. And I definitely listened more to other people back then than I did to myself. But yeah, it was sort of the future I could see for myself. I remember even my dad was like, "Oh, I can totally imagine you working in Brussels or some international organization." And it was unexpected when I suddenly started to feel homesick. It really was like I didn't think it would happen, but it just did. I think I started realizing that family is something I really value. A lot more maybe than work and everything that came with sort of living abroad.
What are some of the things you think you picked up along the way? So despite the fact that you decided that you wanted to be home, again, eventually home being Latvia, what were some of the things that you feel you took from your experiences in Scotland and elsewhere?
I think the main thing is it's going to sound very cliched, but just the diversity of people, of everything there is in the world, the range of opportunities that are open to everyone. That would be, yeah, the biggest sort of takeaway. Obviously, on a personal level, just having friends everywhere, knowing that wherever you go, there's someone there who who you can meet up with. And with that comes the realization that even though, yeah, I mentioned this huge diversity, those people may live in different countries and come from very different backgrounds. But then my friends, because we share so much, we have so much in common. And that somehow I think is a really key moment, that the realization that no matter how different we think we are fundamentally, yeah, there's always similarities.
Can you talk us through, as best as you can, the thought process of returning?
Well, it was the return to Latvia was quite sudden. So I came to realize that I missed Latvia, and then I started looking for jobs, and bam, within 2 months I was actually back. I got really lucky. I applied for one job and I got the job. So yeah, I think that probably also helped because I just didn't have that much time to think, rethink. I just went and did it. And then I also took my ex-partner with me. He was British. He is British. And when we arrived, we started living at an apartment that belongs to my family. So we had somewhere to live, which was also godsend. I had a job. He was going to freelance. So we kind of had the practical side of things covered. And it was more about getting our social lives back up and running, and finding ways to literally just fill out time outside of work. And gradually we decided to start lifeinriga.com. At the time it was a joint project, since he's a web designer and I'm copywriter. And the blog was just a way for us to document our experience and try to help others in a similar situation, because certainly at the time, and I think even now, information is pretty scarce about what it's like to live here. The information that you do get a lot of the time comes from official sources, so it's quite one-sided. Tends to be either a bit dry or too advertising. So we wanted to kind of share a real person's perspective of life here. And I've kept it going because for me it's also been one way of helping myself kind of understand my own journey and my own decisions and why I'm here and what I'm doing. And yeah, it's become a very personal project over the years, even though it's just me doing it now.
Yeah, I can feel that through your writing, and it reminds me, even though this project was first before I started these Saprotu conversations. I think I really resonate with this idea of just processing life and who you are through some kind of external medium, and you're. I will say, from my opinion, you are correct that there are not other places to get this information. So despite the fact that I'm diaspora Latvian, there really weren't spaces, one, in English that I could show my husband, that could, again, you put it perfectly, that weren't either too touristy and irrelevant to regular everyday life, or legalese that no one can understand. And also there just aren't, unless you're an expat, you don't think about the fact that people don't know, for example, steps of practical, normal, everyday things. And so we very quickly found your blog as a resource, because there really isn't anything else that's speaking in the same voice as that. What are some of the things that you think you noticed coming back to Latvia as an adult that maybe you didn't notice when you first lived in Latvia as a child?
Obviously, as an adult, you have to deal with like a whole host of things that you could never have imagined as a kid, starting with just your everyday, getting a mobile phone, paying bills, visiting doctors, and having to arrange all that on your own without getting the support of your parents. So yeah, I got a lot more exposure to just customer service and public sector organizations and their processes, or lack thereof. So I think the biggest surprise was just how few things seem to be really thoroughly organized. And in the beginning, having just come back from the UK that has, lots of established systems and years of experience in running things, I had this kind of typical, attitude that, this is all so terrible, why can't things be done the proper way here in Latvia? And it took me a few years to realize that, like, hey, there's a pretty good reason for that. There hasn't been that much time to get things up and running since Latvia became independent, and a lot of things are completely new. And digitalization is new to everywhere, not just Latvia. So it's kind of okay that things are the way they are, and I think complaining never really helps. But yeah, it took me a while to understand that and accept that for myself, rather than just choosing the route.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And can you give some examples of positives that lived up to what you were hoping to get coming back, but also challenges, things that either expectedly or unexpectedly were difficult for you?
I think the great thing was that it was somehow easier than I thought it would be to pick up on the friendships that I'd had. It was somehow like no time had passed. I mean, obviously, I'd stayed in touch with people while I lived abroad, but I was really afraid that, people change with age, people start settling down, and that we might not have that much in common anymore. But yeah, that was completely unjustified. It's ended up being completely fine, and if anything, we've grown together again. And I've kept those friendships that I had from school and summer camp and the youth parliament. So the social side of things worked out quite easily, and with Alex, my ex-partner, we also met a few people through the internet, like expats groups, and we soon found other international couples, which there are a lot of in Latvia. So I think it's actually not difficult to meet people. Riga is very, very small. It's quite easy to even just physically arrange a time and place to meet, which I know can be a challenge in bigger cities with people living, at either ends of this metro line or whatever. And then, yeah, just finding things to do. It was a lot easier, I think, as well than we thought it would be. Our calendars just kind of, ended up filling up. We'd take hikes at the weekend, or do things like skiing in winter, and yeah, there's just a lot available. Even cinemas, everything, everything's here. And maybe we both had this fear of not maybe not having as much to do as we were used to in the UK. But again, that was completely unjustified and just some random silly stereotype.
And what were some of the challenges, either expected or unexpected?
Some of the challenges were, I think, work related would be the first that comes to mind. Just a very different work culture. Whereas in the UK, I worked for a company that had like a really clear onboarding system and employee benefit scheme and team building every once in a while. When I moved here, the first company that I worked with, and then since then I've had a similar experience, you're kind of expected to just understand what's expected from you at work. And rather than receiving training, you kind of have to ask the right questions to figure out what your role really is. And I found that really intimidating and maybe at times even humiliating, because sometimes when you don't really know and there's nothing you can do other than ask, and then yeah, you get the kind of like snarky attitude, like you should know that, or how do you not know that? And I've heard that from a few people. It's a bit of an odd one, but it's the way things are done here. So that was maybe one of the negative things. And then other than that, you mentioned the legal language, the legal talk. That's something that I get frustrated with as well. When you look for an answer to what you think is a pretty straightforward question, like something related to tax or or utilities or whatever practical aspects. You can find answers, but the question is whether you can actually understand them, because they are written in such non-human language. You really need to like hire a lawyer to explain it to you. And then sometimes when you call them to explain, you understand that the person on the other end of the line might not even get it themselves. So I think that's something we can all work on.
Yeah. And then what do? Then they email you the law.
Yeah.
They say, here's the law. They don't say, here's the answer to your question. They'll just say, read this.
Yeah.
I very much identify with that. And then also notice when people have explained things in a slightly more human manner. I appreciate it. Yeah. So big question. Do you now feel like you belong here in Latvia? And if you feel like you belong here, what informs that? And if you feel like you don't quite belong here, what is that from?
The belonging thing took time. I had this kind of wow moment. I think it was last year. I even blogged about it because it suddenly dawned on me that I finally did feel like I belonged. And I can't really pinpoint an exact moment or an exact reason why it happened. But it was probably just time and experience and just growing up in general. I just suddenly kind of came to all these conclusions about what I wanted out of life, and how everything that I wanted and expected was here, was available. And I just kind of grew out of the idea that that traveling is a must, and leading an international lifestyle is just the way that people live these days. And well, it can be, but it doesn't have to be. And I'm not saying I might never live abroad again, but for now, Latvia is fine, or more than fine. It's home, and I have stable relationship now with a Latvian. We don't intend on moving anywhere in the near future. My friends are all sort of settling down. We're now early mid-30s, and just the natural way of life. People are getting married, having kids, and I don't want to leave all that behind. I like to be involved. I think a big part of it is also having my family here. My sister, who has 2 kids, who I love spending time with, and I just really can't imagine being away from them for a long time.
Excellent. You've interviewed and talked to quite a number of expats through your blog, and I'm sure outside, you said socially, you've met a number of international couples as well. Are there things that you've picked up in these conversations that you can kind of relay to us as kind of common themes, common threads, as well as things that you've picked up maybe are tips or ways that people have been able to integrate a little bit more successfully or smoothly?
A lot of the expats I know are couples where the female is Latvian and has brought her other half to Latvia. Whether it's related to close family ties or wanting to raise children in Latvia. We have a really good environment, I think, for young families to raise their children in. Lots of access to nature, and just not as many people as there are in the really big cities around Europe. So that's definitely a common theme. And I find that a lot of the time it can be difficult for the international part, or the foreign part of the couple to find work in Latvia, and therefore get that kind of sense of belonging and independence. I think for the Latvian part of the couple, it just comes naturally because they have family here. They have a network from their previous life, school or university. And that was the case for me as well with my British ex-partner, that it was very difficult for him to establish kind of an independent lifestyle for himself here.
Have you, continuing along those lines, have you met couples in which they've kind of gotten over that hump? And if so, what were maybe some of the things that they did or figured out that allowed them to get beyond that?
I've spoken to a few people about it, and I think one of the keys is learning Latvian, or maybe in some cases Russian. It really depends on the circumstances and which part of the country you live in, so that you can start to develop friendships and contact with locals rather than just an expat circle. That's definitely a major thing. And also finding work and having a team and having something to do apart from being at home, being with your family.
Excellent. Yeah, hard to do when you're self-employed. When you're a contractor. I've met quite a few traveling couples or couples that have been more free to move to Latvia because they do some kind of remote work. Again, so many interruptions today. Okay, I can do this. Who are able to move because they have remote work or a different type of work, but then, obviously lack that when they move here. They don't have a team around them, and they don't, and it's not an automatic way to then integrate because you don't have that group of locals around you. So despite having that financial stability of perhaps having a job coming in, you don't have that other piece, which can be challenging.
Well, one thing that I hear again and again from people is to really give yourself time, to not expect everything to fall into place at once, to embrace the frustrations, to understand that you're not the only one going through what you're going through, and not blaming everyone else for things not working out, or just expecting this cocktail of emotions that's going to be around for maybe a year or 2 or 5 or 6 or 7, because moving somewhere isn't going to be easy unless you're moving for something specific that you've been able to plan for. I think just not expecting miracles.
Yeah. And it's such an interesting thing because logically you can tell yourself it's going to be difficult. I think most people know, or at least expect it to be difficult. But, and I can only speak for my own experience, but I would imagine it would be similar for some people. It feels so individual when you are in it and it feels so your thing, but then you get to a point where you realize, oh, they had a very similar experience here, or they struggled with a very similar thing. And for me, it was really helpful to start to hear that and then to start to feel like I was part of, it's an odd way to say it, but part of a group of people who were experiencing the same thing. It didn't feel quite as lonely anymore once I realized that, and also a little bit hopeful, as you said, it may be 1 year, maybe 2 years, maybe 4 or 5 or 6. And to know that maybe at some point in the future, you won't feel quite as frustrated or as up and down or as not having the knowledge that you need to accomplish something, is really helpful. But logically you can think it, but to experience it as a whole is something you can't quite prepare for. You just have to know it's coming.
When my parents left Australia, they only told me this recently, but they somehow also felt that they wanted more out of life. They wanted some unpredictability and you know, some experiences that they couldn't see coming. In Australia, they led really comfortable lifestyles, and they could kind of foresee that continuing for the rest of their lives if they wanted it to. And then they upped and left. And I think in that way, they definitely gained exactly what they wanted and more. You know, they can say they've had really exciting lives, really dynamic lives, lots of unexpected moments, ups and downs, obviously, but they've had really rich and rewarding lives. And I certainly hear from them that they don't regret their decision. And obviously they still are in touch with their friends and family that stayed behind. And they love going back, but they've made it work in Latvia, and seen their daughters grow up, and my sister has a family of her own now with a Latvian partner. And yeah, things have really worked out. And I think that's the case for many people who make these decisions. At the end of the day, it works out.
Yeah,
and if my sister or I had decided to move back to Australia or somewhere else, I'm sure they would deal with that and it would be absolutely fine. It's a question of acceptance and understanding that each person has the right to their own choices.
Yeah. And it almost seems as though if you can get past that initial hump of just figuring things out and figuring your own space out, then you can make that decision a bit more clearly of, is this the space that I need to be in right now? Does this place work for me? Or does it not? But yeah, you're not thinking, again, I can only speak for myself, but I definitely have not, and still sometimes do not think rationally about things when I get hit with some huge cultural difference or something unexpected. But yeah, people get past that and then, get over that hump and do say, oh, well, now I'm settled in this new place. And you're right, the challenge, and not everyone wants this in their life, but the challenge can bring rewards that you never expected, and you can learn things about yourself that there's no way you could learn it by staying in one place. So yeah. Any other thoughts?
I just love the way that both of us share this kind of hobby or characteristic of wanting to explore who we are, where we come from, where we fit in, and that this is not only useful to us but also to other people.
Yeah, I hope so, because again, for me, realizing that other people felt this way was helpful, and certainly I think I don't think I would be mistaken in saying that I read some of your blogs as well that talked about, okay, this is difficult, but I think I've muddled through it. For example, customer service. Okay, it's taken me a while to get used to, but I think I can live in a place where customer service is not quite the same as in other places. Yeah, so I really love that too, and I'm really glad that we got a brief chance to hear at least a piece of your story. But any final thoughts?
To anyone wanting to move here, I'd say not to focus too much on the stereotypes that you might have heard. Maybe don't read too many comments on social media. Don't just rely on the news to get information about Latvia. But sources like this, like Mara's video series and my blog, the Expats in Latvia forum on Facebook, they might help paint a better picture of what life is really like in Latvia, and just try to see if you can read up on life here as much as you can before coming, so that you have a fewer surprises when you do eventually move, if you do.
Yeah, great advice. Well, thank you very much for talking to us today, and best of luck. I look forward to continuing to read your blog.
Likewise with your video series, I look forward to continuing to watch. And thank you, Mara.